The Indonesian Finance Minister looked at what Iran was doing in the Strait of Hormuz and said, why not us? Not in private, not in a closed diplomatic cable, out loud, publicly, because the logic is the same. Iran closes a strait, Iran demands payment for transit, the global economy holds its breath, Western governments scramble for a response. And the Indonesian Finance Minister, watching all of this from Southeast Asia, looked at the Malacca Strait and asked the one question that the architects of the American response to the Hormuz crisis have not fully accounted for in any public statement about what this conflict's resolution actually looks like for the world order. It is reshaping. If Iran can charge a toll booth for the Strait of Hormuz, why can we not charge one for the Malacca Strait? Follow that logic one step further and ask it globally. What happens if Morocco and Portugal charge transit fees at Gibraltar? What happens if Panama decides the canal toll is not sufficient and adds a per-barrel energy surcharge? What happens if Turkey charges a per-barrel fee for every tanker transiting the Bosphorus? What happens if Chile implements a transit fee at the southern tip of South America, add $1 per barrel at 10 strategic maritime choke points? And you have $10 per barrel additional cost on global energy, 10 to 15% global energy inflation, not because of a war. Because Iran demonstrated that the choke point leverage model works, and every other country that controls a choke point on the global energy map is now doing the arithmetic of what their choke point is worth. That is the consequence the Strait of Hormuz crisis has produced, that no American naval operation, no blockade, no strike on Bandar Abbas and Keshem, and no SEAL team seizure of Shadow Fleet tankers in the Bay of Bengal addresses, because the consequence is not military, it is precedential. And precedent does not go away when the military situation that established it is resolved. The Iranian toll booth idea has been put into the world. The Indonesian Finance Minister has said it out loud. The global choke point map is being studied by finance ministers and strategic planners in every country that sits adjacent to one. And the post-World War II world order that maintained freedom of navigation as an inviolable principle of global commerce has just experienced the demonstration that it is violable, enforceable by a regional military power willing to accept the economic pain of confronting it, and worth studying by every regional military power that has not yet tried. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why the Indonesian Finance Minister's question is the most consequential single statement to emerge from the Strait of Hormuz crisis beyond anything the IRG or CENTCOM has communicated, you need to understand the full scale of what the strait's closure actually represents for the global economic architecture, why the COVID-19 comparison is analytically accurate in ways that most commentary has not fully unpacked, and why the assessment from the world's leading maritime AI intelligence company about how long this blockade can continue tells you something more honest than any diplomatic statement about what the next several months actually look like. Here is where we stand as of May 10, 2026. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 22-25% of the world's total energy supply through a waterway that is 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Not just oil, 25% of the world's LNG supply transits the same corridor. Approximately 50% of the world's helium supply transits the same corridor, and 15% of the world's container shipping transits through related Trans-Alley connections to the strait. The global economy was not built to absorb the removal of 25% of its energy supply in a single operational decision. The time frame for adjustment is not days or weeks, it is months and years, and the reserves that buffered the initial shock of the closure are being depleted in Asia right now in real time, in many places. Across Asia today, there is no fuel, not expensive fuel, not rationed fuel, no fuel. People cannot fill their cars regardless of how much money they have. The strategic petroleum reserves that were supposed to provide a buffer against exactly this kind of supply disruption are approaching the point where their consumption rate since the closure began is visible in the data. The world was operating on just-in-time supply chain logic. Retailers did not maintain large inventories because shipping was reliable to within a day's variance, and inventory on the water was functionally the same as inventory on the shelf. The Strait of Hormuz closure turned inventory on the water into inventory in limbo. Over 1,000 vessels containing shipping from 87 countries are stranded or have been stranded in the Persian Gulf. The just-in-time system has not just been disrupted, it has been demonstrated to be insufficient for a world where a single regional military actor can close the primary transit corridor with fast attack boats and mines and dare the most powerful navy on Earth to reopen it at acceptable political cost. Now let me give you the maritime intelligence picture that most public reporting on this conflict is missing, because the data flowing from multi-source maritime surveillance is telling a story about the Strait of Hormuz that is more operationally accurate than either the American or Iranian official communications have been. As of early May 2026, automatic identification system transponder shutoffs in the Gulf have increased by 600% compared to pre-conflict baselines, 600%. Vessels are turning off their AIS transponders at a rate that reflects the specific operational discovery that Iranian targeting of ships in anchorages, in port waiting areas, and in the strait itself has made broadcasting your location a navigational death wish. Ship owners and captains are choosing to accept the maritime regulations. violation of operating without transponders rather than broadcasting their position to an erg that has demonstrated it will fire at vessels in locations that ship operators previously considered safe. The Iranian attacks on ships in anchorages, in what the pre-war maritime operating environment defined as protected waiting areas, broke the assumption that there were safe zones in the Gulf that broadcast location without consequence. The 600% increase in transponder shutoffs is ship operators' collective answer to that broken assumption, and it has produced a surveillance blackout over the Gulf that has become so significant that the United States government formally restricted access to commercial satellite data above the Gulf as of April 14th. Open-source researchers and commercial shipping intelligence companies that had been using commercially available satellite imagery to monitor the strait found their access revoked. The U.S. government determined that publicly available satellite data over the Gulf was providing operational advantage to actors it was trying to constrain, and it turned the access off. What is visible in the Gulf without special means is now essentially nothing. The pre-war average of approximately 130 vessels per day transiting the strait is now running at 3-4% of that baseline. 4 or 5 transits per day through a waterway that was handling 130 daily movements. The closure is not theoretical or partial. It is operating at 96-97% effectiveness as measured by the reduction from pre-war transit volumes. Now let me show you what Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority represents, because this is the detail that most coverage has treated as a darkly comic sidebar rather than the geopolitically significant precedent it actually establishes. Iran stood up an administrative body it calls the Persian Gulf Strait Authority and published its contact information on LinkedIn with a phone number. The message was explicit. If you want transit services through the Strait of Hormuz, contact us. The United States responded immediately with the countermeasure available in the financial domain. Any vessel whose owner makes payment to the Persian Gulf Strait Authority for transit services will be sanctioned. Any company that processes that payment will be sanctioned. Any financial institution that facilitates the transaction will be sanctioned. The American countermeasure is legally and institutionally sound. It closes the financial pathway for the toll booth model to generate revenue for the Iranian regime. But the precedent it is countering cannot be closed by sanctioning the specific payment mechanism. The precedent is that a regional military power established an administrative authority claiming the right to charge for transit through an international strait, published the authority's contact information, and invited the world's shipping companies to pay for passage. That has never happened in the post-World War II era. The legal framework that governs international maritime transit, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, does not permit sovereign states to charge commercial transit fees for passage through straits used for international navigation. Iran established an authority claiming that right anyway, and the Indonesian Finance Minister's response was not outrage at the illegal precedent, it was interest in the model. That gap between the legal prohibition and the financial minister's interest in replication is where the precedential damage to the post-World War II international order lives. The law says it is illegal. The Indonesian Finance Minister is asking whether the law is enforceable when the state claiming the toll has fast attack boats, mines, and ballistic missiles and is willing to use them. Now let me address the question that is hardest for Western analysts to sit with honestly, because it is the question that the most operationally credible maritime intelligence available on the blockade's strategic effectiveness makes unavoidable. Is the blockade going to break the Iranian regime in a time frame that matters for global energy markets? The honest answer, based on the analysis of the Iran-Iraq War and the behavioral patterns of Shia fundamentalist governance, is that the blockade is causing extraordinary economic pain in Iran and is not by itself likely to produce regime collapse in a politically relevant time frame. The Iran-Iraq War ran for 8 years. Approximately 1 million people died. The fighting produced conditions of extraordinary human suffering across Iran's civilian population, and Iran continued for 8 years before accepting ceasefire terms that gave Iraq approximately what Iraq had been seeking from the conflict's beginning. The Shia fundamentalist governance system has a specific feature that differs from the calculus Western governments apply to economic pressure campaigns. It does not treat the suffering of its population as a primary constraint on policy because the governance framework positions that suffering within an ideological narrative of martyrdom, resistance, and divine justice that makes the suffering meaningful rather than simply painful. Cuba has been under American trade restrictions for decades and has not changed its governance system. Russia has been under Western sanctions since 2014 and has intensified its military operations since the sanctions were applied. Hezbollah survived the assassination of its leadership, the Beeper attack that wounded 4,000 of its fighters, and 2.5 years of direct Israeli military pressure without disintegrating as an organization. The Iran-Iraq comparison is the most directly applicable historical precedent because it involves the same governance system under existential military and economic pressure for an extended period, 8 years, not 8 weeks, not 8 months, 8 years before a ceasefire. The blockade is 97% effective at preventing Iranian oil from reaching buyers through the strait. It is costing Iran $500 million per day. It is a devastating economic instrument. It is not a guarantee of regime collapse in the time frame that global energy markets require for normalization. Read that carefully, not because it suggests the blockade is the wrong strategy. but because understanding the realistic timeframe for the blockade's strategic effects to produce political change in Tehran is the foundation for understanding why the deal window that the negotiations are attempting to keep open matters so much. The blockade works on the energy and financial infrastructure of the Iranian regime. It will eventually produce the conditions where the security apparatus cannot be paid reliably, where the proxy networks cannot be financed adequately, and where the domestic political conditions create opportunities for the internal political change that the blockade cannot directly produce from outside. That process takes longer than 7 weeks. It may take 7 months. It may take longer. And the global energy markets, the Asian manufacturing economies operating without fuel, the European industrial sectors absorbing elevated energy costs, and the American gas prices that have crossed $4 per gallon do not have indefinitely elastic tolerance for the timeline required for the blockade to produce Iranian political change from internal pressure. The financial pressure and the military capability to enforce the blockade are genuine. The timeline for the blockade's strategic effects to force a regime change or a genuine nuclear surrender in Tehran is longer than the global economy's patience for the energy disruption the closed strait is producing. That is the honest tension at the center of the deal window. The blockade is working economically. The blockade timeline exceeds what the global energy system can absorb without structural damage. The deal has to close the gap. Now let me give you the way's strategic situation in the full detail it deserves, because the Iranian decision to specifically target the Fujairah oil facility during Project Freedom was not indiscriminate retaliation. It was the most strategically precise single strike Iran has executed in this entire conflict, aimed at the exact target that would maximize strategic damage to the alternative energy supply architecture that Saudi Arabia and the Way have been building to reduce global dependence on Hormuz transit. The Way left OPEC in May 2026, removing itself from production caps that had been constraining its output below its actual productive capacity, and was operating the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline from Habshan to Fujairah at capacity, moving approximately 3 to 4.5 million barrels per day through a route that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Fujairah is on the Gulf of Oman side of the strait. Vessels loading at Fujairah never enter the waters that Iran controls. The pipeline makes Iranian control of the strait irrelevant to Way oil exports. Iran understood this precisely. The single most strategically significant target Iran could strike on the day Project Freedom launched was not an American destroyer, not a commercial vessel from a third-party nation, and not a Way civilian facility chosen for symbolic value. It was the Fujairah oil infrastructure specifically, because destroying Fujairah's operational capacity reduces the Way's bypass export capability from 3 to 4.5 million barrels per day down to approximately 1 million barrels per day. That reduction of 3 to 3.5 million barrels per day from the non-Hormuz export corridor is 3 to 3.5 million barrels per day that the global market now cannot source through the bypass and must either source through the strait under Iranian interdiction risk or source from alternative producers at elevated prices. Iran struck Fujairah because it is the specific facility that makes Iran's Hormuz leverage irrelevant to Way exports. Reducing Fujairah's capacity from 4.5 million to 1 million barrels per day is the most efficient available action for restoring Iranian leverage over Way energy exports that the bypass pipeline had eliminated. That is not a random attack on a convenient target. That is a strategically precise strike on the specific facility, whose operational capacity determines whether the Way is inside or outside Iran's energy leverage envelope. Now let me take you into the satellite surveillance architecture that has been assembled over the Gulf, because understanding the intelligence picture that American forces are operating from tells you something about the asymmetry between what the United States can see in the strait and what it chooses to allow the public to see. As of April 14th, the United States government restricted commercial access to satellite imagery of the Gulf. Open-source researchers and commercial intelligence platforms that had been providing public monitoring of vessel movements in the strait found their data access revoked. The U.S. government made this decision because publicly available satellite data was providing operational intelligence to actors it was trying to constrain. The restriction is itself an operational indicator. If the satellite data were not useful to those actors, there would be no reason to restrict public access to it. The fact that the access was restricted tells you the satellite coverage of the Gulf is sufficiently detailed and sufficiently current to provide real-time operational intelligence about vessel positions, fleet movements, and strike target identification. The same surveillance architecture that tracks shadow fleet tankers attempting to exit through the Strait of Hormuz, that detects the 90 ERG fast attack boats observed in a single day's satellite imagery, that monitors dark transits of vessels that have turned off their AIS transponders, is the architecture that informs every American interdiction operation, every CENTCOM strike targeting decision, and every naval positioning calculation that the carrier strike groups execute. The 5 vessels per day that the maritime surveillance tools are tracking as transit completions, compared to the pre-war baseline of 130 per day, represents a 96% closure rate that is visible in the data without requiring access to classified intelligence. The 4% that is moving represents either vessels operating with quiet approvals between governments that have negotiated private arrangements outside public announcement, vessels that have accepted the risk of dark transit and have not been interdicted, or vessels whose transit has been facilitated by operational agreements. that the intelligence picture allows the American command to make decisions about without requiring public confrontation over each individual crossing. Now let's bring the three-track convergence into the full picture, because the maritime intelligence data, the geopolitical precedent analysis, and the strategic resilience question are three simultaneous tracks running through this crisis that none of the individual operational reporting has fully connected. Global economic resilience. Track. The COVID-19 just-in-time supply chain failure demonstrated that global commerce is structurally vulnerable to unexpected disruption of established transit routes. The Hormuz closure has produced a second demonstration of the same vulnerability in a different domain at a different scale. In Asia, fuel availability is already constrained. European energy imports are under pressure. AIS transponder shutoffs are 600% above baseline. Satellite data access has been restricted. 1,000+ vessels are stranded or have been stranded in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are building a land bridge to Jordan specifically to move containers out of the Gulf for European markets that cannot wait for the strait to reopen. The global supply chain is not adapting rapidly to the closure, it is absorbing the closure. Through reserve depletion that has a finite duration. That duration is the economic clock that runs parallel to the military blockade and the diplomatic deal window, geopolitical precedent track. The Iranian toll booth model has been publicly proposed. The Indonesian Finance Minister has asked why it could not be applied to the Malacca Strait. The post-World War II freedom of navigation framework has been operationally challenged by a regional military power that has maintained its challenge against the world's most powerful. Navy 4 months. The world order that rested on the American naval guarantee of international maritime access is, in the words of the Maritime Intelligence Analysis, done, not weakened, done. The U.S. was the policeman of the free world and financed NATO and Europe and dispatched carrier strike groups wherever a problem arose. That world is gone, and there is now consensus in the United States about its going. The consequence of that consensus arriving simultaneously with Iran's demonstration that chokepoint leverage works is that every other regional power with access to a maritime chokepoint is performing a calculation that it was not performing 2 years ago. Strategic resilience adaptation track. The response to the Hormuz closure that will persist after the deal is signed is not military, it is infrastructure. Saudi Arabia's petroline running 5 to 7 million barrels per day to Yanbu on the Red Sea, the Suez Fujairah pipeline when it is repaired and restored to capacity. Saudi Arabia's Jeddah 9 port network connecting directly to Chinese, Japanese, and European maritime hubs, the MSC hybrid seal and route across Saudi Arabia. Iraq's $24 billion development road connecting Basra to the Mediterranean through Turkey. All of this infrastructure is being built and accelerated specifically because the Hormuz closure demonstrated that the single route dependency model is strategically catastrophic and that the political will to build alternatives is a function of how much pain the single route dependency has produced. The pain is producing the infrastructure will eventually produce the resilience. The timeline for the infrastructure to be operational at sufficient scale is years, not months, and the years between now and the infrastructure being fully operational are years during which the chokepoint leverage model remains viable for any regional actor willing to use it. Here is the honest assessment of the strategic question that the maritime intelligence experts' analysis of Shia fundamentalism raises and that most optimistic Western analysis of the deal timeline avoids. The blockade is real. The economic pain is real. The $500 million per day in lost revenue is real. The storage ceiling approaching at Karg Island is real. The well shutdown sequence is real. The URG's inability to pay its soldiers reliably is real. All of the pressure the blockade is applying is real and is producing genuine effects in the Iranian economic and social system. And the 89-year history of Shia fundamentalist governance under maximum external pressure, the Iran-Iraq War, 2 decades of Western sanctions, the Beeper attack on Hezbollah, the targeted killing of Soleimani and other senior leadership, multiple rounds of international isolation, says that regimes built on ideological foundations that position suffering as sacred resistance do not collapse on Western timelines, not because the suffering is not real, because the ideological framework provides a mechanism for absorbing suffering that Western secular governance frameworks do not have. This is not an argument for abandoning the blockade. It is an argument for understanding that the blockade creates conditions. It does not directly produce the outcome. The conditions the blockade creates, financial desperation, security force payment failures, proxy network defunding, are the conditions in which internal Iranian political dynamics can produce regime change or genuine policy change. That internal dynamic operates on its own timeline. The deal window exists to allow the process to reach an agreement before the timeline of global economic tolerance for the closed strait forces either a military escalation that nobody has fully modeled the consequences of or a political capitulation that would validate the Iranian toll booth model for every other chokepoint holder. In the world, the strait is at 4% of pre-war transit volumes. Asia is operating without fuel in parts of its geography. AIS transponder shutoffs are 600% above baseline. The U.S. has restricted commercial satellite access over the Gulf. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are building a land bridge to Jordan. The Fujairah bypass is at 1 million barrels per day instead of 4.5 million. The Indonesian Finance Minister is asking about the Malacca Strait. The Iranian contact number for the Persian Gulf? Strait Authority is still published on LinkedIn. The maritime intelligence picture shows 5 vessels per day where 130 used to transit. The blockade is 96% effective. And the question that the most credible maritime intelligence analysis available has raised without fully answering is how long 96% effectiveness and the global economic pain it is producing need to continue before the internal Iranian dynamics that only that sustained pressure can produce reach the threshold that ends. This confrontation on terms that neither validate the toll booth precedent nor require the military escalation that the one big blow language describes. The clock is running, the reserves are depleting. The infrastructure alternatives are being built, and the world is watching to find out whose timeline runs out first. Drop your predictions in the comments. Does the deal close before the global economic tolerance for the closed strait breaks, or does the blockade timeline exceed what the world can absorb before Iranian internal dynamics produce the political change that makes the deal possible? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The maritime intelligence data is updating daily, the transponders are off, the strait is at 4%. And the Indonesian Finance Minister is still thinking about the Malacca Strait. We will see you in the next one.